Miami, Florida. It was Wednesday night, February 17, 1982, approximately 11:45 at night, when Detective Robert Palomino of the Miami-Dade Police Department closed the folder containing the file for case number 82U4471, leaned back in his office chair worn out by years of use, and realized that he had been staring at the truth for weeks without recognizing it for what it was. The file contained documents related to the murder of Alberto Bravo, a 34-year-old Colombian who had been found shot dead in a parking lot at Dadeland Mall on July 14, 1979, almost 3 years earlier. A case that officially remained unsolved, filed away among hundreds of other drug-related homicides that had turned Miami into the world capital of murder during those violent years. But that night, while reviewing testimonies that had come through a confidential informant operating within the Colombian cocaine distribution networks, Palomino finally understood what had really happened in that parking lot 3 years earlier. And the truth was more disturbing than any theory the police had considered during the original investigation. Alberto Bravo had not died in a clash between rival gangs, as the investigators had initially assumed. He had not been the victim of a drug robbery gone wrong. He had not been murdered by competitors trying to eliminate a successful distributor. Alberto Bravo had been executed on the orders of his own wife, Griselda Blanco, the woman the DEA would eventually call the godmother of cocaine, the woman who controlled a significant portion of the cocaine trafficking between Colombia and the United States, the woman who, according to multiple sources, had personally ordered more than 200 murders during her criminal career, and who apparently made no exception when she decided that her own husband represented a problem that needed to be eliminated permanently. The story that the informants had provided, corroborated by multiple sources who did not know each other and therefore could not have coordinated their testimonies, began not in Miami but in Medellin, Colombia, approximately 18 months before Alberto Bravo died in that shopping center parking lot. Griselda Blanco and Alberto Bravo had met in the mid-1970s, when both were operating in the burgeoning cocaine export business that was transforming Colombia from a relatively poor country into the epicenter of a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry. Bravo was attractive, charismatic, violent when the situation required it, and ambitious enough to impress a woman who had already shown that she did not tolerate weakness in the men around her. They married in 1975, and for several years they functioned as partners both in marriage and in business, building together a trafficking operation that moved hundreds of kilograms of cocaine monthly from Colombia to Miami, New York, and Los Angeles. But by late 1978, the marriage had begun to deteriorate in ways that Bravo apparently did not fully understand. Griselda had discovered, through her extensive network of informants and loyal employees, that Bravo had been diverting money from their joint operations into personal accounts in Panama. The amounts were not huge in the context of a business generating millions of dollars monthly, perhaps $200,000 in total over the course of a year. But the act of stealing from Griselda Blanco, even a relatively small amount, represented a betrayal that she could not tolerate. Not because she needed the money, not because the financial loss significantly affected her operations, but because allowing anyone, any person, including her own husband, to steal from her without consequences would set a precedent that would undermine the entire structure of fear and respect that kept her criminal organization functioning. If Alberto Bravo could steal from her and survive, then anyone could try the same, and the reputation that Griselda had carefully built, the reputation of being absolutely ruthless with anyone who betrayed her, would be destroyed. In addition to the theft, Griselda had received reports that Bravo had been romantically involved with another woman, a younger Colombian, who worked as an accountant for one of the front companies they used to launder money. This infidelity, combined with the theft, created a situation that Griselda apparently considered intolerable. She did not confront Bravo directly. She did not give him a chance to explain himself or return the money or end the extramarital relationship. Instead, she began methodically planning how to eliminate her husband in a way that could not be traced back to her, that would appear to be the result of the kind of random violence that plagued the drug trafficking world in Miami during those years, and that would allow her to keep all the assets of their joint operations rather than having to divide them in a divorce. The man Griselda selected to carry out the murder was named Jorge Ayala, known in Colombian criminal circles as Rivi, a 27-year-old hitman who had already carried out multiple contract killings for Blanco's organization and who had proven to be reliable, discreet, and absolutely lacking in scruples about whom he killed as long as the payment was sufficient. Ayala had grown up in the poor neighborhoods of Medellin, had learned to kill before turning 15, and had emigrated to Miami specifically because Griselda Blanco had offered him steady work as an enforcer for her organization. For Ayala, killing Alberto Bravo was not fundamentally different from killing any other target. The fact that Bravo was his employer's husband was irrelevant. What mattered was that Griselda was willing to pay $50,000 for the job, a considerable sum even for a high-profile murder, and that successfully completing the job would solidify Ayala's position as the organization's primary hitman. The instructions that Griselda provided to Ayala were specific and detailed. The murder had to appear to be the result of a drug-related confrontation, not a planned execution. It had to occur in a public place where there would be witnesses who could confirm that multiple shooters had been involved, creating the impression of a shootout between rival gangs. There had to be enough chaos and confusion that the police would have difficulty reconstructing exactly what had happened and who had shot whom. And crucially, it had to appear that Alberto Bravo had been the initial aggressor, that he had attacked someone and died in the resulting shootout, eliminating any suggestion that he had been specifically targeted. What Ayala organized was an operation involving 4 men besides himself, all Colombian hitmen who worked regularly for Blanco's organization, and who understood that asking questions about why they were killing their boss's husband was not advisable for their continued health. The plan was simple, but effective. Alberto Bravo had a meeting scheduled with a supposed cocaine buyer in the Dadeland Mall parking lot on the afternoon of July 14, 1979. That meeting had been arranged by Griselda herself, though Bravo did not know his wife was involved. Bravo believed he was meeting a new distributor from New York who wanted to establish a direct business relationship, someone who could potentially buy large quantities of cocaine monthly and who represented an opportunity to expand operations into new markets. When Bravo arrived at the parking lot in his white Mercedes around 2 in the afternoon on that hot July Saturday, he found not a potential buyer, but Jorge Ayala and his associates waiting for him in an unmarked white van. What happened next lasted less than 2 minutes, but left a scene of violence that would traumatize the mall shoppers who witnessed the shootout, and that would become one of the most infamous incidents in Miami's criminal history. Ayala and his men opened fire on Bravo's Mercedes as he tried to escape, shooting with automatic pistols and at least 1 submachine gun that shredded the vehicle and killed Bravo almost instantly. But Bravo was armed, as almost all cocaine traffickers of that era were, and he apparently managed to fire several shots before dying, wounding one of the attackers and creating exactly the kind of confusing mutual shootout scene that Griselda had wanted. The attackers fled in their van, leaving behind a wounded man who would later die in a hospital without being identified, and leaving a crime scene so chaotic that the initial investigators concluded they had witnessed a clash between rival gangs in which both sides had suffered casualties. The police investigation that followed was thorough, but fundamentally mistaken in its premises. The detectives assumed that Alberto Bravo had been the victim of competitors trying to eliminate a successful distributor, or that he had tried to rob someone more powerful and had paid the price. No one seriously considered the possibility that his own wife had ordered his death, in part because that seemed too monstrous to be credible, and in part because Griselda Blanco had played the role of grieving widow with a perfection that convinced investigators, associates, and even members of her own extended family that she was genuinely devastated by the loss of her husband. At Bravo's funeral, held in a Catholic church in Miami 3 days after the murder, Griselda cried so convincingly that several attendees would years later remember being moved by the apparent depth of her grief. Dressed entirely in black, holding the hand of one of her children while the priest recited prayers for the soul of the deceased, Griselda projected the image of a woman whose life had been destroyed by the senseless violence of the drug trafficking world, a victim as much as her dead husband. No one in that church, except Jorge Ayala, who attended as one of Griselda's security employees, knew that the widow crying in the front pew had paid $50,000 to ensure that her husband ended up in that coffin. What finally exposed the truth, almost 3 years after the murder, was a combination of circumstances that Griselda had not been able to anticipate. Jorge Ayala, the hitman who had led the murder team, had been arrested in January 1982 for an unrelated homicide and, facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison, had begun negotiating with federal prosecutors, offering information about Colombian drug trafficking operations in exchange for a reduced sentence. Among the information Ayala provided were details about multiple murders he had committed on behalf of Griselda Blanco, including the murder of Alberto Bravo in the Dadeland Mall parking lot. The story Ayala told investigators, recorded in multiple interrogation sessions that totaled more than 40 hours of testimony, was so detailed and so internally consistent that the prosecutors concluded it must be true. Ayala described the planning meetings with Griselda, the specific instructions she had provided, the $50,000 payment divided among the participants, and Griselda's personal role in setting up the fake meeting that had lured Bravo to the parking lot where he died. Ayala even provided details that only someone directly involved in the murder could have known, including the exact description of the weapons used, the positions of the shooters, and the last words Bravo had shouted before dying. For Detective Palomino, reading the transcripts of Ayala's interrogations that February night in 1982, the truth was simultaneously horrifying and strangely logical once you understood who Griselda Blanco really was. She was not simply a criminal. She was not simply a drug trafficker who had accumulated power and wealth in a violent industry. She was something more fundamental, something Palomino had occasionally encountered during his years investigating organized crime, but had never seen manifested so completely. Griselda Blanco was someone for whom human relationships, including marriage, existed solely as tools to achieve her objectives, and for whom eliminating any person, including her own husband, was simply a tactical decision comparable to closing a business that had ceased to be profitable. What made the case particularly disturbing for Palomino was not just the act of murdering a husband, though that was monstrous enough. It was the methodical coldness with which Griselda had executed the plan, the way she had continued living with Bravo for months while organizing his death, the perfection of her performance as a widow after the murder, and the apparent ability to compartmentalize her emotions in such a way that she could order the death of someone with whom she shared her life and her bed without showing any external sign of internal conflict. The files contained photographs of Griselda taken at various social events in the months following Bravo's murder. In none of those photographs did she appear to be a woman tormented by guilt or affected by the trauma of having lost her husband. She smiled at parties, attended business meetings, oversaw drug trafficking operations that moved millions of dollars, and raised her children with what all observers described as genuine affection. It was as if the murder of Alberto Bravo had been simply an administrative problem that required a solution, not an act of violence against someone she had supposedly loved. Palomino closed the file, knowing that the case would probably never result in criminal charges against Griselda Blanco. Jorge Ayala's testimony, though detailed and credible, came from a confessed killer who was negotiating to reduce his own sentence, and any competent defense attorney would destroy his credibility before a jury. There was no physical evidence linking Griselda directly to the murder. There were no recordings of the planning conversations. There were no documents showing the payments to Ayala. What existed was the word of a hitman against that of a woman who had the resources to hire the best lawyers in the country and who had repeatedly demonstrated her ability to manipulate the legal system. But even though the case never went to trial, even though Griselda Blanco never faced legal consequences for the murder of her husband, the truth now existed in police files and in the minds of the investigators who knew it. Alberto Bravo had died because his wife had decided he was more useful dead than alive. He had died because he had made the mistake of stealing money from a woman who did not tolerate being stolen from. He had died because he had fundamentally underestimated the nature of the person he was married to, perhaps believing that marriage provided some kind of protection that in reality had never existed. In the years that followed, as Griselda Blanco continued expanding her cocaine empire and accumulating an ever-growing list of ordered murders, the Alberto Bravo case would become a kind of legend within the law enforcement agencies pursuing her. It was the definitive proof that Griselda recognized no boundaries of any kind, that personal loyalty, family ties, shared history, none of it mattered when it conflicted with her interests or when someone made the mistake of betraying her in any way. If she could order the death of her own husband with the same coldness with which she ordered the deaths of competitors or informants, then truly no one was safe in her proximity. On September 3, 2012, more than 3 decades after the murder she had ordered in that shopping center parking lot, Griselda Blanco would herself die assassinated, shot by a hitman on a motorcycle as she left a butcher shop in Medellin, Colombia. The method of her death was ironic given that she had popularized the use of motorcycle hitmen for murders during her years of power in Miami. No one was arrested for her murder, no one probably ever would be. But many who knew her story saw a kind of poetic justice in her dying, in the same violent manner she had inflicted on so many others, including the man she had once promised to love until death did them part, without understanding that she herself would decide when that death would come. The 1982 newspaper article that eventually revealed the details of the Bravo case to the public appeared in the Miami Herald under a headline that captured the disturbing essence of the story. Wife orders murder of drug trafficker husband, hitman reveals details. But no headline could truly convey the depth of the horror that case represented, the way it exposed not only the brutality of the drug trafficking world, but the human capacity to compartmentalize emotions in ways that allowed a person to order the death of their partner while maintaining the appearance of a normal married life. Griselda Blanco had achieved something most people could not even imagine, living a double life so completely that none of the people who knew her, neither her husband, nor her employees, nor her own children, suspected what she was planning until Alberto Bravo lay dead in his destroyed Mercedes, while mall shoppers fled in terror from the violence that had erupted among them. That was the truth about the death of Alberto Bravo. It was not an unsolved mystery. It was not the result of random drug trafficking violence. It was a murder methodically planned by his own wife, executed with criminal professionalism, and covered up by a performance of mourning that had deceived everyone who witnessed it. And that truth, finally documented in police files and in the testimony of a hitman who decided to talk to save his own life, revealed Griselda Blanco for what she really was. Not simply a criminal, but something darker, a person for whom love, marriage, and family were simply tools to be used and discarded when they no longer served her purposes.